Laughter echoed through the dining room, but it wasn't mine. I sat quietly, stirring the salad on my plate, pretending not to hear the sarcastic comment my husband, Jake, had just made about my second helping. It was a small gathering, just a couple of friends and family members, but his words stung as if he had shouted them across a crowded stadium. "Careful there, honey," Jake said with a smirk, raising his glass for a toast. "We don't want the chair to give out under you." Everyone chuckled uncomfortably, but no one dared to call him out. I smiled weakly, my cheeks burning as I fought back tears. This wasn't the first time Jake had commented on this, and deep down, I knew it wouldn't be the last. It hadn't always been this way. When Jake and I met, he was kind and attentive. He told me I was beautiful every single day. No matter what I was wearing or how I looked, I fell in love with the way he made me feel seen and cherished. But over the years, something shifted. His compliments became less frequent, replaced by criticism and jokes at my expense. At first, I thought he was just stressed from work, but the comments grew sharper, more frequent, and harder to ignore. The weight gain started gradually, an extra dessert here, a skipped workout there. Life happened, and like many people, I turned to comfort food during tough times. Between juggling a demanding job and the responsibilities of running a household, taking care of myself fell to the bottom of the list. And yet, I never thought it would change the way Jake saw me. "Maybe if you joined me at the gym, you wouldn't feel so self-conscious," Jake had said one evening, his tone laced with condescension. I nodded, feeling too defeated to argue. At first, I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was his way of motivating me. But over time, his words began to cut deeper, chipping away at my confidence bit by bit. It wasn't just the comments, though. Jake's behavior extended beyond words. He started ignoring me in public, choosing to stand a little too far away during group photos, as if to distance himself from me physically. At home, he would scroll through fitness influencers on social media, his phone angled just enough so I could see the toned bodies and perfect smiles. The final straw came during a family barbecue. I'd spent hours preparing everything, cooking, decorating, making sure the day was perfect. As I was setting the table, Jake loudly declared, "Well, at least all this cooking explains why you've been packing on the pounds." The laughter that followed was deafening. I froze, clutching the serving spoon like it was my only anchor to reality. Later that night, as I scrubbed dishes alone in the kitchen, I replayed the moment in my mind, the embarrassment clinging to me like a second skin. Jake was in the living room, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. For years, I had accepted his words as the truth. Maybe I wasn't good enough. Maybe I didn't deserve his respect. But something shifted that night, a flicker of anger, a tiny spark of determination. I didn't know it then, but that moment would become the turning point in my story. I was done letting someone else dictate my worth. I wasn't sure where to begin, but I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life shrinking under the weight of his words. As I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, I made a quiet vow to myself, not for him, not to win back his approval, but for me, for the person I used to be before his words made me doubt myself. Little did Jake know, the very weight he mocked would become the force that broke free from his control. The comments didn't stop. If anything, they became sharper, more cutting. Each one was a jab, a reminder of how little Jake valued me. He didn't just criticize my weight, he criticized what it symbolized to him: weakness, laziness, failure. At least, that's how he made it seem. "Are you really going to wear that?" he asked one morning as I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the hem of my dress. "It's not exactly." Forgiving, his eyes traveled over me like I was a stranger, someone he barely tolerated. I swallowed the lump in my throat, brushing off the comment with a small laugh. "It's just a dress, Jake." "Exactly," he replied. "And maybe if you spent as much time at the gym as you do shopping for clothes, it would actually look good on you." I felt my face flush with embarrassment and anger, but I bit my tongue. Arguing never worked with Jake. He always had a way of twisting my words until I felt like I was the one in the wrong. The breaking point came one Saturday afternoon when we were invited to a friend's pool party. I hadn't felt comfortable in a swimsuit for years, but I went anyway, determined not to let my insecurities ruin the day. Jake, of course, made sure to add his commentary. "Are you really going to swim?" he asked as we walked out to the pool area. "You know, you could have waited to buy a new swimsuit until you lost a little weight." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried just enough for the group nearby to hear. I saw the uncomfortable glances, the way people avoided eye contact. My cheeks burned with humiliation, but I forced a smile and said nothing. Later, as I sat by the pool watching everyone else laugh and splash in the water, Jake approached me with 2 drinks in hand. He handed me one and plopped down next to me, his eyes scanning the crowd. "You know," he said, leaning closer, "maybe you should start hanging out with Lisa more. She's always at the gym. Maybe you'd pick up some good habits." I turned to look at him, stunned by his audacity. Lisa was one of the fittest people I knew, sure, But what hurt most was how easily Jake compared me to her, as if my worth was tied solely to my appearance. Something inside me snapped. "Jake," I said, my voice low but firm. "Do you even hear yourself?" What he replied, feigning innocence. "You're cruel," I said, my voice shaking. "Do you have any idea how your words make me feel? Or do you just enjoy tearing me down?" Jake rolled his eyes, taking a sip of his drink. "Oh, come on, don't be so sensitive. I'm just trying to help." "Help," I said, my voice rising. "You call this help? Constantly criticizing me, making me feel small? That's not help, Jake. That's abuse." The word hung in the air like a slap. Jake's face hardened, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he stood up and walked away, leaving me alone by the pool. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as Jake snored softly beside me. His words replayed in my mind, each one like a stone weighing me down. I thought about the woman I used to be, the woman who loved herself, who felt confident in her own skin. That woman felt like a distant memory, but she wasn't gone. I reached for my phone and started scrolling through old photos of myself. There I was, smiling brightly, hiking with friends, laughing at family gatherings. I looked happy. I was happy. Tears welled up in my eyes as I realized how much of myself I'd given up to please Jake. I had bent over backward to make him happy, to earn his approval. And for what? To be ridiculed? To feel like I was never enough? That was the night I decided enough was enough. The next morning, I woke up before Jake and went for a walk. It wasn't much, just a slow, steady lap around the neighborhood, but it felt like a start. As I walked, I thought about all the things I'd stopped doing because of Jake's comments. I used to love dancing, but I hadn't been to a class in years. I used to cook vibrant, healthy meals, but I'd fallen into the habit of eating whatever was easiest to avoid his complaints. I thought about all the times I'd put his needs above my own, all the ways I'd let his words define me. And with each step, I felt a little bit of that weight lift. When I got home, Jake barely noticed I'd been gone. He was too busy scrolling through his phone, probably looking at fitness influencers or whatever else he thought I should aspire to be. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't care. I wasn't walking for him. I wasn't changing for him. This was about me. Over the next few days, I started making small changes. I packed healthy lunches for work. I dusted off my old yoga mat and followed along with beginner videos online. I even signed up for a dance class, ignoring the voice in my head that worried about how I'd look compared to everyone else. Jake noticed, of course. Trying to prove something, he asked one evening as I stretched in the living room. "Not to you," I replied simply. He laughed. But it didn't matter. For the first time, his words didn't sting. I had found my breaking point, and now I was ready to rebuild. One step at a time. Starting over felt like standing at the base of a mountain, staring up at a summit I wasn't sure I could reach. The voice of doubt was loud in my head, echoing Jake's words, "You'll never stick with it. Why even bother?" But for once, I didn't let that voice win. I had made a promise to myself, and for the first time in years, I was going to keep it. I began with small, deliberate changes. Mornings became my time. Instead of hitting snooze, I rolled out of bed and went for a walk around the neighborhood. The air was crisp, and the world felt quiet, almost like it was rooting for me. At first, my legs ached, and I could barely make it around the block without feeling winded. But each morning, I pushed a little further, taking pride in every extra step. To keep myself motivated, I downloaded a fitness app. It wasn't about drastic weight loss, it was about tracking progress and celebrating small victories. On day 5, I logged my first full mile. On day 10, I noticed my pace improving. Every notification from the app felt like a tiny cheerleader, reminding me that I was moving forward. Food was another hurdle. Jake had always insisted on ordering takeout greasy burgers, heavy pasta dishes, pizza with extra cheese. It was easier than cooking, he'd say. But deep down, I knew it was a habit born from convenience and apathy. One evening, while Jake was out, I decided to try cooking again. I dusted off an old recipe book and made a simple stir-fry with fresh vegetables and grilled chicken. The process felt oddly therapeutic, chopping vegetables, stirring the sizzling pan, plating the vibrant dish. When I took my first bite, I smiled. It wasn't just about the taste, it was the satisfaction of doing something for myself, something healthy and nourishing. Jake, of course, had something to say when he got home. "What's this?" he asked, wrinkling his nose at the plate I'd left on the counter for him. "Rabbit food." I didn't take the bait. "It's dinner," I said calmly. "You can eat it or order something else." He muttered something under his breath but sat down to eat anyway. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to explain myself. Days turned into weeks, and my small changes started adding up. My morning walks turned into jogs, then runs. I joined a local gym and started taking group fitness classes. The first time I stepped into the studio, I felt completely out of place. Everyone looked so fit and confident, and I was sure they were judging me. But as the class started, I realized something: no one was paying attention to me. They were focused on their own workouts, their own goals. It was freeing, and by the end of the session, I felt proud just for showing up. The instructor, a bubbly woman named Tara, came up to me afterward and said, "You did great. Keep coming back, you've got this." Her words stuck with me, and I made it a point to attend her class every week. At home, Jake's attitude didn't change much. He continued to make snide remarks, rolling his eyes whenever I laced up my running shoes or packed a salad for lunch. "Are you trying to turn into one of those fitness freaks?" he asked one evening, as I stretched on the living room floor. "Maybe," I replied, not looking up. He laughed, but it sounded hollow. I could sense his discomfort, his growing frustration that I wasn't reacting to his jabs the way I used to. The power dynamic between us was shifting, and he didn't like it. The real turning point came a few months later when I attended a work event. It was a formal dinner, and I decided to wear a dress I hadn't fit into for years. When I zipped it up and looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. My face looked brighter, my posture more confident. At the event, my coworkers were quick to notice. "You look amazing," one of them said. "What's your secret?" I smiled, feeling a mix of pride and gratitude. "Just taking care of myself," I replied. For the first time in a long time, I felt genuinely proud of who I was becoming. Jake, however, didn't share the sentiment. When I told him about the compliments I'd received, he scoffed. "People just say that to be polite," he said, barely looking up from his phone. His dismissiveness hurt, but it didn't derail me. If anything, it fueled my determination. I wasn't doing this for him, I was doing it for me. As the weeks went on, I started branching out in ways I hadn't imagined. I signed up for a charity 5K run, nervous but excited to test myself. On race day, I stood at the starting line, surrounded by strangers who shared the same goal to cross the finish line. The run was tough, and there were moments when I wanted to quit. But as I approached the final stretch and saw the cheering crowd, something inside me shifted. I wasn't just running a race, I was reclaiming my life. Crossing that finish line felt like breaking free from all the doubts and negativity that had held me back. When I got home that evening, medal in hand, Jake barely acknowledged it. "You're really into this whole fitness thing." "Huh," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "I am," I replied firmly. He stared at me for a moment, as if seeing me for the first time. But instead of pride or admiration, his eyes held something else: fear. He was losing the control he'd once had over me, and he didn't know how to handle it. That realization was liberating. For so long, I had let his opinions shape the way I saw myself, but now I was finally looking in the mirror and liking what I saw, not just physically, but emotionally. I was stronger, more confident, and more resilient than I had ever been. The transformation wasn't just about losing weight or gaining muscle. It was about finding myself again, about realizing that I deserved better than the life Jake had tried to confine me to. And with each step forward, I felt a little bit lighter, not because of the pounds I'd lost, but because I was finally free of the weight of his words. And this was just the beginning. As my confidence grew, so did Jake's irritation. He noticed the changes in me physically and emotionally, and it rattled him. The woman he'd once dismissed, mocked, and controlled was slipping through his fingers, and he didn't know how to handle it. "You've been spending a lot of time at the gym," he said one evening as I returned home, sweat-soaked but exhilarated from a particularly intense class. "Yeah," I replied casually, setting my bag down. "I really enjoy it," he scoffed. "Don't let it go to your head. You're not some Instagram model or something." I didn't respond. I had stopped letting his words sting, but I could sense his growing frustration. Jake wasn't used to being ignored, and the more I focused on myself, the more desperate he became to get a reaction out of me. One evening, as I was getting ready for a work dinner, the tension finally boiled over. I chose a dress I hadn't worn in years, a sleek black number that hugged my figure in all the right places. When I walked out of the bedroom, Jake looked up from his spot on the couch, his eyes narrowing. "Is that what you're wearing?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "Yes," I replied simply, adjusting an earring. "It's a bit much, don't you think?" "Not at all," I said, meeting his gaze without flinching. He stared at me for a moment, clearly taken aback by my newfound confidence. "You're trying to show off, huh?" I didn't rise to the bait. Instead, I grabbed my purse and headed for the door. "Don't wait up," I said over my shoulder. At the dinner, my coworkers couldn't stop commenting on how great I looked. It felt good, not just the compliments, but the way I carried myself. For the first time in years, I felt like me again. When I returned home that night, Jake was waiting, his arms crossed. "How was your little show?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Excuse me," I replied, setting down my purse. "You know what I mean," he said. "Parading around in that dress, soaking up attention like you're some kind of celebrity." I took a deep breath, determined not to let him ruin my night. "Jake, I went to a work event. I dressed appropriately, and I had a nice time. That's all." He didn't reply, but the look on his face spoke volumes. He hated that I was no longer seeking his approval. that I was thriving in ways he couldn't control. Over the next few weeks, his behavior became more erratic. He would alternate between sarcastic remarks and overly enthusiastic compliments, as if trying to figure out which approach would bring back the old, submissive version of me. "You're doing great with this whole fitness thing," he said one morning, his tone insincere. "But don't forget you've got a long way to go." I didn't even bother replying. Another time, he tried to sabotage me outright. One evening, as I prepared a healthy dinner, he came home with a bag of greasy takeout and set it on the counter. "Figured you'd want a break from all that rabbit food," he said with a grin. "Thanks, but I'm good," I replied, sticking to my plan. He frowned, clearly annoyed that his attempt to throw me off track had failed. The breaking point came during a family gathering. Jake had always loved being the center of attention, and he clearly wasn't thrilled that people were noticing my transformation. "You look amazing," Jake's cousin said, giving me a once-over. "What's your secret?" "Just focusing on myself," I replied, smiling. Jake chimed in before I could say more. "Yeah, she's turned into a bit of a gym rat," he said, laughing. "I guess it's a phase or something." His words stung, but I refused to let them show. "Actually," I said, meeting his gaze, "it's not a phase. It's my life now." The room went quiet, and Jake's face flushed. He didn't expect me to stand up for myself, not in front of his family. Later that night, as we drove home, the tension in the car was palpable. Jake finally broke the silence. "You're different lately," he said, his voice low. "I am," I replied. "I don't like it," he admitted. "You're acting like you don't need me anymore." I turned to face him, my voice steady. "Jake, I don't need you. I want a partner who supports me, not someone who tears me down. If you can't be that person, then maybe you're right, we don't need each other." He didn't respond, but the silence spoke volumes. For the first time, I saw the fear in his eyes, the fear of losing control, of losing me. From that moment on, I knew things would never be the same. Jake's pride had been his armor, and my growth had shattered it. I wasn't the same woman he'd married, the one who had let his words define her. I was stronger now, and I wasn't going back. The battle between my growth and his pride wasn't over, but one thing was clear: I was winning. The first time I realized how much I had changed wasn't in the mirror or on a scale, it was in the way people started reacting to me. The woman who used to blend into the background was now someone others noticed. Compliments came from unexpected places: friends, coworkers, even strangers. But the most significant shift wasn't external, it was internal. For years, I had lived under Jake's critical gaze, letting his words and actions dictate my self-worth. Now, I saw things clearly. His insults no longer felt like truths. His sarcasm no longer cut deep. The power he once held over me was slipping. And for the first time, I felt in control of my own life. The moment that crystallized this shift came during a company charity gala. It was a formal event: elegant dresses, champagne, the works. I had spent weeks preparing, determined to feel as confident as I looked. When the night arrived, I wore a deep red gown that hugged my curves in all the right places. My hair was styled, my makeup flawless. For the first time in years, I felt stunning. Jake, on the other hand, seemed irritated from the moment we left the house. As we arrived at the venue, he lagged a step behind, barely offering his arm as we entered. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with energy. As we mingled with coworkers and acquaintances, the compliments started pouring in. "Wow, you look incredible tonight," one of my colleagues said, her eyes wide with admiration. "Stunning," another chimed in. I thanked them graciously. My confidence grew with each interaction. Jake, however, grew increasingly sullen, his forced smile fading into a thin-lipped scowl. Later that evening, a senior executive approached us, congratulating me on a recent project I had spearheaded. "Your dedication is inspiring," he said, raising his glass. "We're lucky to have you on the team." Jake cleared his throat loudly, drawing attention back to himself. "Well, she's certainly been dedicating herself to a lot lately," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. The executive raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. I smiled politely, choosing to ignore Jake's attempt to belittle me. As the night progressed, Jake's frustration became more obvious. He made passive-aggressive comments whenever someone complimented me, his jealousy bubbling just beneath the surface. The breaking point came during the auction segment of the evening. Jake had wandered off to get another drink, leaving me chatting with a group of coworkers. As the auctioneer called out for bids on a luxury spa retreat, a coworker nudged me. "You should totally bid on this," she said with a grin. "You deserve it." Before I could respond, Jake returned, drink in hand. "Oh, please," he said loudly. "She wouldn't know what to do at a spa. She's too busy playing dress-up these days." The group fell silent, their smiles fading as the weight of his words sank in. My heart pounded, but not with embarrassment, with anger. For years, I had let Jake's words slide, convincing myself it wasn't worth the fight, but not tonight. I turned to face him, my voice steady and calm. "Jake, do you hear yourself? Do you realize how small and insecure you sound right now? He blinked, clearly taken aback. I was just joking, he said defensively. No, you weren't, I said, my voice firm. You were trying to tear me down because you can't handle the fact that I'm thriving without your approval. The group around us stood frozen, their eyes darting between us. Jake opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. I turned back to the auctioneer and raised my paddle. $1,000, I called out confidently, ignoring the stunned look on Jake's face. When the auctioneer declared me the winner, applause erupted around the room. I smiled, feeling a rush of pride. For the first time, I had stood up to Jake in a public setting, and it felt incredible. On the drive home, the tension was palpable. Jake was fuming, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. You embarrassed me tonight, he said finally, his voice low and bitter. No, Jake, I replied calmly. You embarrassed yourself, and you've been doing it for years. The silence that followed was deafening. Over the next few days, the power dynamics in our relationship shifted even further. Jake tried to regain control in small, petty ways, criticizing my cooking, making snide remarks about my gym routine, but his efforts felt hollow. One evening, I found him scrolling through his phone, his expression dark. What's wrong, I asked, more out of curiosity than concern. He hesitated before replying. People are talking about the gala, he said. About how you stood up to me. I raised an eyebrow. And it's humiliating, he snapped. You made me look like a fool. No, Jake, I said, my voice steady. You made yourself look like a fool. And if you're upset about it, maybe you should reflect on why that is. His jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized something profound. Jake wasn't just losing control over me, he was losing control over himself. His pride, his ego, his need to dominate, they were crumbling under the weight of my growth, and I wasn't going to stop. A week later, I attended a friend's birthday party without Jake. It was a liberating experience, surrounded by people who celebrated my accomplishments instead of diminishing them. When I returned home, Jake barely looked up from the couch. You're out a lot lately, he said, his tone accusatory. I am, I replied simply. You think you're too good for this marriage now? I paused, considering his words. I think I've outgrown the version of myself that tolerated being disrespected, I said. He stared at me, his face a mixture of anger and disbelief, but I didn't waver. The balance of power had shifted, and for the first time I was the one holding the reins. I didn't know exactly what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't the same woman who had let Jake's pride define her worth. I was stronger now, and I wasn't afraid to show it. The moment I knew I was truly ready to move on wasn't a dramatic revelation. It was quiet, almost mundane, a morning spent sipping coffee on the balcony, the sunlight warming my face. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace, a feeling that life was mine to shape. Jake, on the other hand, was spiraling. His attempts to control me had become desperate, almost pathetic. He'd try to win me back with grand gestures, a fancy dinner reservation here, an expensive gift there, but the charm that once worked no longer held sway over me. One evening, he came home with a bouquet of roses, the kind he hadn't bought in years. He set them on the counter and gave me a sheepish smile. I've been thinking, he began. I haven't been the best husband, but I want to fix things. We can start fresh. I stared at the roses, their vibrant red petals a stark contrast to the gray monotony of our marriage. There was a time when this gesture might have melted my heart, but now it felt hollow. Jake, I said, my voice calm but firm. You don't get to erase years of disrespect with flowers. This isn't something we can fix. His face fell, the weight of my words hitting him like a physical blow. You're serious, he said, more a statement than a question. I am, I replied. I'm done living like this. I deserve better, and I'm not afraid to go after it anymore. For weeks after that conversation, Jake oscillated between anger and desperation. Some days he'd lash out, blaming me for everything wrong in our relationship. Other days he'd beg me to reconsider, promising he'd change. But my decision was firm. The final act of moving on came when I packed my belongings and left the house we had shared. With the help of my best friend, Lisa, I found a cozy apartment in a neighborhood that felt like a fresh start. As I unpacked, I came across a framed photo of Jake and me from our early days together. For a moment, I hesitated, memories flooding back, but then I placed it face down in the box, a symbolic gesture of closure. Jake, of course, didn't take the separation well. He texted me incessantly, alternating between apologies and accusations. You'll regret this, he wrote one night. No one will love you like I do. I didn't respond. His words, once powerful enough to shatter my confidence, now felt small and meaningless. My true revenge wasn't something I planned. It unfolded naturally as I embraced my new life. I threw myself into work, earning a promotion that had once felt out of reach. I rekindled old friendships, surrounded by people who uplifted and celebrated me. I even began dating again, though cautiously, allowing myself the grace to heal fully before committing to anyone else. But the most satisfying moment came months later when I bumped into Jake at a local cafe. I was meeting Lisa for lunch, dressed in a sleek outfit that showcased my hard-earned confidence. As I approached the counter, I spotted him sitting alone, his shoulders slumped, his face etched with frustration. "Sarah," he said, his voice a mix of surprise and regret. "Jake," I replied coolly, offering a polite smile. "You look amazing," he stammered, his eyes scanning me in disbelief. "Thank you," I said, refusing to let his words carry any weight. He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Do you have a minute? We should talk." I glanced at Lisa, who had just arrived and was watching the interaction with barely concealed amusement. "No, Jake," I said. "We don't need to talk. I've moved on, and I think you should too." The look on his face was priceless, a mix of disbelief and wounded pride. For so long, he had been the one holding power over me, and now he had none. As Lisa and I found a table, I caught him watching me from across the room, his expression unreadable. But I didn't care. My life was no longer about him. The cherry on top came a few weeks later when I heard through mutual friends that Jake had tried dating again. Apparently, his usual charm wasn't working, and the women he pursued quickly saw through his facade. One particularly bold woman reportedly told him, "You're the guy who tried to tear down a strong woman. No thanks." The old me might have felt pity for Jake, but not anymore. His downfall wasn't my responsibility. My success, my happiness, my freedom, those were my focus now. One evening, as I sat in my new apartment, journaling my thoughts, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. Jake's insults had once felt like chains, binding me to a version of myself I no longer recognized. But now, those chains were broken, replaced by a sense of strength I never knew I had. Lisa's voice broke my reverie as she entered with a bottle of wine. "To freedom," she said, raising her glass. "To freedom," I echoed, clinking my glass against hers. Jake's pride might have been shattered, but that wasn't my victory. My true triumph was reclaiming my life, proving to myself and the world that I was so much more than his words. I had moved on, and in doing so, I had found myself again. Sitting on my small but sunlit balcony, I sipped my morning coffee and let the cool breeze wash over me. It had been months since I left Jake and the toxic environment he created, yet it felt like an entire lifetime had passed. The woman staring back at me from the window's reflection was almost unrecognizable, stronger, calmer, more self-assured. I had learned to breathe again, to wake up every day with a sense of purpose rather than dread. There was no longer a critical voice dictating how I should live, no constant barrage of insults eating away at my confidence. Instead, there was peace, a quiet, beautiful peace. Looking back, it was hard to believe how deeply I'd let Jake's words define me. Each sarcastic remark, each passive-aggressive comment had chipped away at who I was until I barely recognized myself. I used to think that if I worked harder, loved him more, or tried to change for him, things would get better. But I now understood that the problem had never been with me. It had always been him. Leaving Jake wasn't just about walking away from a bad marriage, it was about reclaiming my life. I had spent years waiting for him to validate me, to make me feel worthy, when all along I had the power to give that to myself. I had let his pride and his insecurities overshadow my potential, but no more. I thought about the journey I had taken since hitting rock bottom. At first, every step felt like a battle getting out of bed, going for that first walk, ignoring his jabs. But those small victories began to stack up, and before I knew it, I had rebuilt myself piece by piece. The most surprising part of the journey wasn't the physical transformation, though that was satisfying in its own right. It was the emotional freedom, the ability to look in the mirror and feel proud of the woman staring back. My worth wasn't tied to anyone else's approval. It was mine to claim, and I wasn't giving it up for anyone. In the weeks following my separation, I started journaling again, documenting every step of my healing process. It became a form of therapy, a way to process my emotions and celebrate my growth. As I wrote, I realized how many women might be feeling the same way I once did, trapped, belittled, and unsure of their strength. That realization sparked something in me. I began sharing snippets of my story online, posting about my journey toward self-love and empowerment. The response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from women who resonated with my story and thanked me for giving them the courage to take their first steps toward freedom. One message, in particular, stuck with me. It was from a woman named Claire who had been in a similar situation. "Your story gave me hope," she wrote. "If you can find your way out, maybe I can too." Those words solidified my purpose. I wasn't just healing for myself, I was creating a ripple effect, inspiring others to break free from their chains. Jake's insults, which once felt like weights dragging me down, had become the fuel that propelled me forward. His attempts to tear me down had backfired spectacularly, leaving me stronger and more determined than ever. My revenge wasn't in making him feel small, it was in showing him, and the world, just how big I could be. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, I closed my journal and smiled. My journey wasn't over, it had only just begun. I wasn't defined by the pain I had endured or the mistakes I had made. I was defined by my resilience, my courage, and my refusal to settle for anything less than I deserved. To anyone still trapped in the shadows, unsure of their worth, I would say this: you are stronger than you think. The power to change your life is within you, waiting for the moment you decide you've had enough. Take that first step, no matter how small. It won't be easy, but I promise it will be worth it. I raised my coffee cup to the horizon, a silent toast to the woman I had become. I wasn't a victim. I wasn't just a survivor. I was me, stronger, wiser, and finally free. And for the first time in years, I felt ready to embrace whatever the future had in store.